I want to raise this question: what is philosophy? Um, and I'm going to raise it from different perspective, and then I'm also going to look at what different philosophers say about how do they answer this question. So, to start with, I'm just going to lay out a few broad outlines in how to answer this question. So, philosophy. Philosophy. So, what is philosophy? To start with, we can answer this question in two different ways, or there are two different types of answers people give. One answer can be dubbed as positive, so a positive conception of philosophy, and that's the dominant answer. But there are people who define philosophy in more negative sense. I'll explain what I mean by that. More broadly, we can say philosophy as a doctrine, philosophy as an activity, or more precisely as an attitude. So we can divide the types of answers we get to this question, what is philosophy, as type of answers which describe philosophy as a positive discipline which answers certain specific questions, or types of questions, and that is what differentiates it from other disciplines. On the other hand, there are people who define philosophy as an attitude, as an activity, which doesn't aim at discovering anything specific or any specific answer to any specific question, but is an activity or attitude which consists rather in raising question rather than worrying about answers to those questions. Okay, so let's move on a bit. So, what is this positive conception of philosophy? Within positive conception, there are two broadly different answers to this question, what is philosophy? The first one is philosophy is a conceptual activity. The second is philosophy is just like other discipline, it answers some questions or types of questions, but it answers them at a more higher level or more abstract level. So with conceptual activity, for example, sciences, for example, use the concept of cause and effect. Some people would say that, physics, for example, uses the concept of cause and effect. But physics, doesn't really spend too much time on trying to understand the nature of what cause is and what an effect is. Probably because physics is more, even the theoretical physics is more practical in nature, in the sense that it's more concerned with getting answers to the questions rather than worrying about its method and the concepts it uses. So some people would say that philosophy is an activity which does this spade work, where it analyzes what cause is and what effect is without worrying about applying those answers to any answering any specific question. But people just go deeper and deeper in analyzing this concept of cause and effect in many different ways. On the other hand, a more positive conception of philosophy, or a specific conception of philosophy, is not different from other sciences in the type of work it does, or the type of questions it try to answer. But in the level of so it's distinguished from other sciences in the level of abstraction, and I guess also the level of disinterestedness. The second aspect is similar to the conceptual activity as well, but as in contrast to the conceptual activity, or the notion of philosophy as conceptual discipline, or discipline which analyzes concepts, this conception of philosophy actually answers questions like what is and how it is and how it works, whatever we are talking about, but at a more abstract level. So, for example, physics tries to understand the universe and the working of universe, but physics sort of stops at certain points. Philosophy goes even further, tries to answer the questions, which may be, termed as ultimate questions. So physics might try to answer how the universe began, and it might stop at Big Bang. But philosophy might go even further than that and raise the more basic question, how something can emerge out of nothing, for example. or nothing. Is universe eternal, or does it have beginning in time? Is it contingent, etc.? And in answering those questions, it might use the data from different sciences, but it goes at more abstract level, and also is much more disinterested in the sense that physics, for example, is even theoretical physics is ultimately concerned with practical outcomes of the nature, of the knowledge it accumulates. Obviously, even physics has some level of disinterestedness because there are many questions whose practical implications are not necessarily in sight. So they might work at more abstract level than someone who is primarily concerned with application of things. But even in this disinterestedness, physics is somehow related to its practical usage in a way in which philosophy is not. So this is very roughly the the positive side of philosophy. And I gave the example of physics, but you can take other examples. Now, on the other hand, the conception of philosophy is an activity. An attitude. Or some people call it a way of life, a way of and this conception of philosophy defines philosophy and demarcates philosophy from other disciplines, not in the actual answers it gives, but in the way it approaches things. So there are a few things there's a list there are a few things I'm going to mention which are important, but without claiming that this is an exhaustive list. So the first thing is philosophy is questioning attitude. So it questions everything, meaning it raises questions in a way that it doesn't take upon itself that it knows answers to any question, but if you give an answer, it will raise questions about that answer. And that is its basic job. And it emerges out of basic attitude of wonder. So you look at the universe, you look at yourself, you look at You look at human society, you look at different things around you, and you look at approach those things from this sense of wonder, where you want to understand things, but you want a complete understanding. And that complete understanding, you think, won't come on unless you question or have a critical attitude towards the answers you come up with or answers others come up with, and you believe that this sense of wonder combined with this critical attitude is your way of life, and you will not stop at any point accepted a complete explanation. And since it's hard to believe that anybody can come up with complete explanation, so you will just keep going. And with this, your basic attitude become that of questioning rather than answering things. And ultimately, questioning itself become a critical attitude towards the answers different people give itself become the task, permanent or perpetual task of philosophy. And in this context, people say that, so it's not the conclusion which is important, but the question what the question you raise. So even if you come up with conclusion, it's not that important, because you must question your own conclusion and go on without stopping. So this is that attitude which people call philosophy. Some people call philosophy. Now, this second attitude is related to, we can understand this in a bit more specific way by relating it to the question of religion and relationship with religion and its relationship with philosophy. And in a sense, this second attitude competes with religion, because religion sort of claims to provide answers to the ultimate questions. But this type of philosophy criticizes religion because, not just because religious answers are based on sources which are obscure, but also because religious answers purport to be final answers about the riddle. And in a sense, if we believe that we have final answer, then that curiosity or that sense of wonder, basically, according to this attitude, will die away. So, in a sense, this conception of philosophy as a negative attitude considers religion its competitive, because if we accept this conception of religion according to this conception of philosophy, then wonder will die away and the philosophy will die away. So in a sense, this notion of philosophy as a critical attitude, permanent critique, this conception of philosophy, people who believe in this conception of philosophy, they consider religion as their competitor, because if people actually accept religious answer, which are final answer, then it would be a death blow to this conception of philosophy. So that's why the people who practice this sort of philosophy, they think that philosophy, as they understand it, cannot prosper in a religious milieu, or in a religious civilization, or at least it is incompatible with the religious attitude. And different, for example, Heidegger raises this question, or whether philosophy in this sense is compatible with religion, and at least his initial answer is no. So that's and the last and final thing is philosophy, this conception of philosophy and its relationship with modernity. And philosophy in this negative sense basically emerged with modernity, with Descartes, and then with Kant. Even though both Descartes and Kant have their own positive philosophies as well, but both Kant and Descartes, Descartes through his method of doubt, and Kant through his conception of critique, are sort of proponents of this negative conceptions of philosophy. And they are both, in their own way, founders of modern philosophy, or the pillars of modern philosophy. So philosophy in this sense come into existence with the rise of modernity, because before modernity you had in Europe, or in those areas where this philosophy emerged, Christian civilization. And in Christian civilization, theology, although philosophy existed, but philosophy was a conceptual discipline in the first sense, and it was a tool of theology, so to speak, or at least subservient to the Christian civilization as a whole. And you can't imagine philosophy in this negative sense, in the second sense we describe as a absolute critique or perpetual sense of wonder or questioning, could have prospered in a Christian civilization, or even in an Islamic civilization. So because the main thing was theology, and you're supposed to have the final answers. So how can that attitude be compatible with Christian civilization? This is not to deny that individual people can't emerge who practice this sort of philosophy, but you can't you it's hard to imagine that this sort of conception of philosophy would actually prosper as a discipline and would be supported by society in a Christian or in a non-modern civilization. So when this conception of philosophy as a critical enterprise it emerged with in the dying days of the dominance of Christian civilization. And it emerged within universities, and its emergence basically coincided with and partially caused by the dominance or the growth of philosophy. So as Christian civilization was coming down, philosophy was coming up, and theology was concept of theology as a subject was going down as well. And the modern philosophers were critical of the methods and type of philosophy which was taught in Christian universities or Christian seminaries. So, for example, when Descartes, although he doesn't, for obvious reasons, doesn't criticize Christian religion directly, but if you look at his method, what he's saying is the set of knowledge which we are taught in our universities is unreliable. Unreliable because it is not based on sound foundations. That's why what we need to do is to reject the existing methods on which knowledge is based and build anew from the scratch, from the beginning. So we start with absolute beginning, and we start it through doubting everything which we can and reject it, because if we can doubt something, then it's not certain. And we stop only where we can't doubt something any further, so that thing would be absolutely certain, and from there we begin totally new building of knowledge on these new absolute certain foundations. And that basically implied, at least, that the existing foundations of knowledge were not sound, and they should be replaced by new foundations which we will arrive at through this negative conception of philosophy as an absolute and perpetual and unceasing questioning and unceasing doubt. Similarly, with Kant, we have a conception of freedom and the conception of critique through which, and this conception of freedom and critique is a negative conception in a sense that your freedom consists in your ability to question anything and everything. And there won't be anything outside this questioning in principle. That was his conception of critique, and that was the very basis of reason. Of course, then he goes on to, develop a self-critique of reason as well. But there's no higher authority than reason itself, and this authority is not subservient to any other authority. And this was basically at least an implied rejection of the whole civilization, which was based on religion, which we call Christian civilization. So what I want to say is that philosophy emerged as a discipline, at least in this second sense, through its this let's say fight or struggle against Christian civilization. And once Christian civilization as a civilization, withered away, and that doesn't mean that Christian religion is still there. Obviously, philosophy doesn't have that, because when it was emerging within Christian civilization, it was in a minority view, but now it's a dominant view because the broader civilizational changes have brought into existence this modern civilization, which is basically what philosophers wanted, what Descartes wanted, or what Kant wanted. So it doesn't have that antagonistic attitude towards the modern civilization and modern conceptions of sciences and knowledge, which it had during the early modern era. So it's very hard to keep to that negative critical postures. So that's why philosophy has to actually invent enemies and pretend that it is still a minority view, or at least a view which is not in full control. So that's why it is an interest of this conception of philosophy to keep religion, or the danger of religion, alive, because without that it can't really, it doesn't seem persuasive that there is something, the critical attitude is still there in the way in which Kantian or Cartesian critical attitude was real, because it was working in an environment which was hostile to it largely. But today, universities, philosophy is one of the departments, but then they are dominated by sciences, which philosophy basically doesn't consider enemy. In fact, one of the tasks of this philosophy is to justify science. So that's why this conception of philosophy has become a minority view, and mostly what philosophers do is do more positive work, conceptual work, and more trying to understand the answers, come up with come up by positive sciences at more abstract level. But still, there is a group of philosophers who are still stuck in the past, and they want to, keep pretending that they are martyrs, or they are minority. Present day Socrates, working in a hostile environment. And but this type of philosophy make more sense in parts of the world where modernity hasn't decisively won. So in those societies, it does make sense for philosophy to more persuasively to portray itself as a critical attitude which is directed against the forces which are uncritical forces in its view. But in those areas where modernity is not dominant, then philosophy necessarily become associated with imperialism, because that's where modernity is trying to impose its view on people who are not really on their own necessarily married to that view. So I think I should stop here. Next, I'm going to pick up one of the definitions of philosophy and see how some philosophers actually try to define their subject.